Thank you very much. If anybody can't hear me at any point, please do shout out. Now, before I share any of my thoughts with you this evening, I'm very curious as to how many analysts we have here in the audience tonight. So I'd like to invite you to raise your hand if you consider your primary professional activity to be undertaking analysis. No? Okay, we're quite light on analysts this evening. That's okay, because my intention with this talk is to appeal to a broad audience and to help people in affiliated roles like Scrum Masters and developers out there to understand their analysts a little bit better. Now, in the title of my talk, I've used the phrase analysis utopia. And if we take the meaning of utopia to be an imagined state in which everything is perfect, what might an analysis utopia look like? Now, even if we had a broad variety of analysts here who have worked in analysis for a number of years, that might be quite a difficult state to define. So I'll start with something easier. Let's consider what a development utopia might look like. It might involve using a ridiculously high number of monitors on your computer that you develop on. It might involve the freedom to address technical debt without having to constantly justify it. Or it might involve maybe the safety of your estimates being treated as estimates rather than as target deadlines. So I have a few admissions to make. I have worked as a developer. I have also been a Waterfall project manager in my time. And I've undertaken various varieties of analysis. And if I had to define my analysis utopia, it would be an environment that boasted three main traits. One, it would be an environment that had active, engaged stakeholders throughout the requirements gathering and implementation process. Two, it would involve an environment that had lightweight but robust feedback mechanisms to let me know that I'm on the right track with my analysis. And three, it would involve an environment that made the best use of my unique skill set and my capabilities. Can you imagine working in such an environment? It sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Unfortunately, I have never worked in such an environment, and I have never seen it in reality. However, I have worked in environments and on certain projects that came close. And the one thing that all of these environments had in common was they had either adopted or were attempting to adopt a more agile way of working. So tonight, what I plan to do is outline three of the top pain points that I've experienced in my analysis career. And I want to describe to you and share how moving from a traditional analysis environment into a more agile way of working has helped to alleviate some of those pain points. Now, before I give you any detail, I do have a list of caveats and definitions to offer. I wouldn't be any sort of analyst unless I hit you with a list of caveats and definitions at the very start. And there's three of them. First, when I use the word analyst, I'm not talking about a pure role or a contractual job title. I'm talking about anybody on a development team whose main focus is on undertaking analysis activity. Second, when I use the word agile, I'm using that in a very broad agile manifesto sense, because I don't think the manner in which it's executed really matters terribly much to my talk this evening. And finally, when I'm offering this analysis utopia, I would like to point out that I'm not saying that Agile is a magic cure-all for all analysis problems, because it clearly isn't. It could be that analysis has been improved because Agile has solved particular pain points at particular employers of mine in the past. And I'm also aware that all of this, every anecdote that you hear, is based on my own personal experiences. And what I describe as my analysis utopia may very well be a traditional, hardcore analyst's idea of dystopia. So with that in mind, let's explore pain point one together tonight. Pain point one is stakeholder engagement. Now, Martin has already referenced this quite extensively tonight. So I'd like to share with you my typical experience of stakeholder engagement as a Waterfall analyst. Typically, my key stakeholder was our project sponsor. Now, the project sponsor is ultimately accountable for making sure that a project succeeded. And a high level of engagement from that particular stakeholder would be their weekly attendance at a steering group conference call. In other words, not a particularly high level of engagement. although on paper they said that they were committed to helping the build team succeed, that didn't translate to their availability or how they prioritized their time. In other words, there was a disconnect between what they said and what they did. My typical output in that environment was to produce a 70, 90, maybe 100-page business requirements document, traceability matrices, we can't forget those, and functional specification documents. This is all stuff that I didn't particularly enjoy writing, and nobody else seemed to particularly enjoy reading. And I want to contrast all of that with my experience of working on Agile projects. So as an Agile analyst, I am working on a close day-to-day basis with my product owner. That product owner has dedicated time and availability to actually answer the build team's questions. And aside from that, they're meant to be a single source of truth for what the business expectations are. And because they're available and they are measured by that availability and how engaged they are in the team, they have a vested interest. At least in my experience, most of the product owners that I've dealt with have had a genuine vested interest in helping the team to succeed. Aside from that, we use that stakeholder engagement in a much more efficient manner, because instead of having every pixel perfect detail set out and defined months or maybe even years in advance, we make the best use of their time by only tackling the most pertinent and relevant upcoming stories and tasks at any given time. In other words, what I'm trying to say is there's a focus on customer collaboration and interaction rather than process. And I think that's made the best use, or it's made a better environment as an analyst to work with my stakeholders. So aside from stakeholder engagement, let's move on quickly to pain point 2, analysis quality control. Now, I'm going to describe to you how I faced quality control as an analyst on traditional waterfall projects, or at least I could, but that would be a very brief description. Because in all the time that I worked as a traditional waterfall analyst, I admit there was very little oversight into how I was actually undertaking my analysis. Even despite the fact that in a lot of cases, there were a lot of BABOK certified and BCS certifications in the room. I basically just did stuff that I thought was going to be and helpful when some implementation date happened months or years later. And although I had the best will in the world, I didn't always know exactly what would be helpful or relevant when implementation started. In fact, at one point, I was working as a traditional analyst, and my employer instigated what they called the rule of thirds. And that was, if a Gantt chart said that a development effort should take 12 weeks, analysis, therefore, should take 4 weeks. That was despite, no matter how complex or simple the project was. And so I wasn't judged on the quality of my analysis. My primary litmus test for being a good analyst was, had I produced a signed-off BRD by the end of that 4th week? That was how we judged a good analyst. Now, apart from that, most of my career, from day one of being a junior analyst, walking into work on the Monday morning in my first pure waterfall analysis role, I've essentially worked alone. Because for the most part of my career, even when projects and programs have been big enough to throw multiple analysts at, we each have our own area, our own remit, areas of responsibility, and it's been purposely engineered to have absolutely no overlap. So aside from that, this raises a larger question of mine, and that is how to judge a good analyst. Now, that's a huge topic. That's a really rather big topic. And one of the thoughts that I wanted to share this evening is that I actually think it's a lot harder to judge a good analyst versus a developer or test team colleague. Because in my experience, testers and developers have much more discipline-based rules, processes, ways of working. You had code peer reviews. You have an agreed way to do branch code mergers. Test leads have direct oversight of what their actual testers are doing. As an analyst, I've never faced much of that. And finally, analysts also deal with stuff that's genuinely harder to measure. So if you're an analyst, more often than our test and development colleagues, we're dealing with business outcomes, bigger picture stuff, and we should try and understand the organizational impact of any change that we're working on. So it is genuinely more difficult to measure a good analyst. The problem with all of this, in this setup that I've just described, you basically can't avoid analysis pain on a project. You can only defer it. So you're kicking the can down the road, and the further down the road those analysis problems are identified, it becomes more complex, more expensive, and much more messy to try and unpick. I would like to now contrast that with the analysis quality control mechanisms that I faced as an agile analyst. The best one, in my opinion, is the Three Amigos model, or Three Amigos framework. We actually have time to spend with development and test colleagues. We're not isolated during the requirements gathering, and we constantly ask, is this ready for development? Do we have a shared understanding? Now, I do see a couple of faces at the back of people that are currently working on a project that I'm working on. And I have an anecdote that genuinely occurred a few weeks ago. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but there was a requirement. It was raised in the form of a user story that was written by somebody that's not located in the Edinburgh office. They're located in London. And it was a fairly good user story, but there was one highly ambiguous line included in that story. And when I read it, I had a fundamentally different interpretation to the one that one of my lead developers and testers had interpreted it as. So basically, to simplify the example, I had interpreted the same line as them, and I had read that the problem was, my porridge is too hot. The lead developer interpreted the exact same wording to be, my porridge is too cold. When the testers were brought in to mediate and figure out what they thought that the porridge was just fine, and we need to make sure we do a regression check to make sure no temperature change had occurred. It was a fundamentally different interpretation. 3 different people, same sentence. But because we had a card and a conversation, we had an opportunity to figure out what the shared understanding was. And there was a risk that if that had been a waterfall project, this ambiguity would have been buried in page 75 of a business requirements document and only clarified later on down the line. It might have been caught during development. It might have been caught during testing. It possibly would have made it all the way into production. The other mechanism that I'm a particular fan of is Bill Wake's INVEST model. Now, I'm actually really surprised at how many people haven't heard of this. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about, after this event tonight, if you care about analysis or think you might be interested in analysis or want to understand your analysts better, go ahead and Google Bill Wake's INVEST model. It's a really nice framework for building good quality product backlog items, and it tries to make sure that each item is independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, small, and testable. So go ahead and Google that if you don't know what I'm talking about. The other thing that we have is a definition of done. Now, I'd never heard of the phrase, what is your definition of done, before I started working on Agile projects. Nobody had ever forced the team to focus on the end goal as much. And finally, we have demonstrations. We actually have checkpoints that are quite regular that allow us to make sure that we're on the right track and that we're building the right thing. Moreover, if my product owners asked us to build a button and the developers have gone ahead and implemented a blue button, but actually they'd imagined a pink one, that's okay because we can respond to change a lot faster. Enough of analysis quality control. Let's move on to pain point 3. The diverse backgrounds and skill sets that lead people into an analysis career. Now, in the time that I was working as a waterfall analyst across multiple employers, essentially, if you are a pure waterfall analyst, you generally have a very strict remit. And on waterfall projects, there's very little flexibility to move beyond that core remit. In this very bank, if you are one of our traditional analysts, you write business requirements documents, you chase business requirements document sign-offs, and you impact assess change requests. And there is very little opportunity, scope, or support for moving beyond that core remit. I would like to discuss how my perception of how that's been handled on analysis projects that are more agile. First of all, I've been actively encouraged to move beyond the breaking this large thing down into smaller chunks And instead, there's been a gear shift, which Martin has already described earlier, into answering questions like, how can we deliver business value? Which is good because it allows this organization to get more out of their analysts. So instead of being treated as one homogenous bunch of people in the analysis pool, despite the fact that we come from very different backgrounds, I'll clarify that. I'm an ex-developer. In the same pool of analysts as me, technically speaking, I've worked with an ex-infrastructure engineer, and I've also worked with a lot of people that come from a retail banking payments expertise background. And we're all lumped together into one analysis pool, and yet we have very different skill sets. So what I'm trying to describe is I'm much more comfortable in an environment where the T-shaped people that I think it was Martin mentioned earlier, are encouraged. Because it means that if developers want to go ahead and do a little bit of testing, that's okay. If analysts want to pick up Scrum Master duties, that's okay as well. It's encouraged. And to my mind, it's a shocking waste of talent in an organization when that isn't encouraged. In summary, what I'm trying to say is, in my opinion, the Agile focus on valuing interactions and people rather than following a strict process is one that's made me a much more effective and happier analyst. Now, at the start of this talk, I explained that my analysis utopia involved 3 main things: active engaged stakeholders, robust feedback mechanisms, and basically an environment that would use my skills particularly well. And I know that we don't have any analysts in the audience tonight because I don't think anybody raised their hand. But that's okay, because what I would like to do is ask the members of the audience tonight, if you are in any way responsible for the care and feeding of your analysts, or just happen to work closely with them on a day-to-day basis, I want you to ponder a few questions when you go away this evening. First of all, how do you incentivize your most important key stakeholders to be engaged in the project that they're working on? Second, how do you let your analysts know that they're doing a good or bad job? And finally, how do you exploit the diverse skill set that your analysts can offer? And on that final question, I would like to also end with a quote. Mine is from Elon Musk, who once said, "A company is a group which is organized to create a product or a service, and it is only ever as good as the people that are in it and how excited they are about creating it." Thank you. Questions, I guess. This is the point for questions. Okay.
I have to go again. So I'm just thinking out aloud here, right? So in my mind, right, if you're an analyst, right, it's very closely related to being a tester. You're kind of verifying input and output. If you're saying, okay, with a certain skill set that's almost transferable into other roles, would you imagine yourself being a tester in that sense?
So I think that's a highly subjective. If you had 15 analysts in the room, you would get 15 different answers. For my mind, for my answer, I would be very comfortable with that, but that just so happened, it's because I come from a development background that I'm comfortable with that. I have worked with very pure traditional analysts who are clearly highly uncomfortable doing the button pressing in that sort of situation. So I'm going to cop out and have the answer of it depends, if that helps. Any other questions about analysis, either in a traditional waterfall environment versus my analysis experience on Agile? In my opinion, analysis is one of the roles that is more, it attracts people that are some of the most adaptable and some of the people that like to learn new things daily and are very comfortable with a generalist mindset. And essentially, I think that it's a role that is not terribly well understood, even if you've been working for years alongside analysts. So this was my opportunity to clarify a few things, or at least offer one opinion. I hope I've done that. Thank you.